History usually tells us that wars are decided by generals, weapons, and strategies. But on one forgotten island in the Bay of Bengal, history took a darker turn. No hero charged. No final battle was fought. Instead, an entire regiment vanished, swallowed by a place humans were never meant to enter. January 26, 1945. WWII Island, Burma. The battle was already over. The British Royal Navy controlled the sea. British and Allied forces held the skies. Japanese supply lines were cut. Escape was impossible. Yet surrender was still on the table. British commanders sent a clear message to the remaining Japanese forces trapped on the island. Lay down your weapons. You will be treated as prisoners of war. You will survive. For most armies, this would have been the end. But Colonel Kenichi Nagasawa was not most commanders. He still had close to 1,000 men under his command. Battle-hardened soldiers. Veterans of jungle warfare. Men trained to endure hunger, disease, and fear. Nagasawa believed surrender was worse than death. His reply was brief. They would fight to the last breath. But there was a problem. They could not fight where they were. British battleships were positioned offshore, raining heavy artillery onto Japanese positions. Every bunker, every trench, every known hiding place was being systematically destroyed. Staying meant annihilation. So Nagasawa chose another path. A path that looked like escape on a map. But in reality, was something far worse. He ordered his regiment to retreat inland, away from the beaches, away from British guns. Into the mangrove swamps at the heart of WWII Island. It was a decision that sealed their fate. The mangroves of WWII stretched for nearly 10 miles. From above, they looked like dense green cover. Protection. A place to hide. But soldiers who had fought in Burma knew the truth. Mangrove swamps were not terrain. They were traps. Thick black mud that could swallow a man whole. Water that was neither fresh nor salt, useless for drinking. Roots twisted like barbed wire beneath the surface. Air heavy with insects, disease, and decay. And something else. Something ancient. British officers watched through binoculars as the Japanese column disappeared into the green maze. One officer reportedly lowered his glasses and said quietly, "Let them go. The swamp will finish what we started." British soldiers did not cheer. They knew what lived there. WWII Island was home to one of the largest populations of saltwater crocodiles on Earth. Apex predators. Territorial. Perfectly adapted to shallow, murky water. And they had been undisturbed for years. The Japanese column entered the swamp around midday. Almost immediately, the rules of war changed. There were no firing lines. No formations. No cover. Only mud. The ground sucked at their boots with every step. Men had to physically pull their legs free. Equipment sank. Rifles slipped from exhausted hands and vanished beneath the surface. Progress slowed to a crawl. Hours passed. They expected to cross miles. They barely crossed a fraction of that. The heat was relentless. The humidity crushed the lungs. Mosquitoes swarmed so thick they formed clouds. Leeches dropped silently from branches, attaching to skin, faces, even eyelids. By sunset, the regiment was broken down physically. Men were shaking from exhaustion. Dehydrated. Barely standing. Colonel Nagasawa ordered a halt. The command was strange and very specific. Stay on the routes. Do not enter the water. The soldiers obeyed, but they did not understand. The water looked calm, still, almost inviting after hours of struggle. Some men thought it was superstition. One young soldier ignored the warning. He lowered himself onto a low branch and let his legs hang just above the surface, trying to cool aching muscles. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the water moved. Not with a splash. Not with ripples. It bulged. A massive shape rose from beneath the mud with terrifying silence. The soldier vanished. No warning. No scream. Just absence. Seconds later, chaos erupted. Shouts. Gunfire. Men pointing at the water. The soldier surfaced briefly, screaming, before being pulled under again. The water churned violently, then went still. The swamp had claimed its first life. Colonel Nagasawa stood on a raised root system and looked out as darkness fell. The sun disappeared behind the trees. And then they saw them. Eyes. Hundreds of small yellow reflections appearing across the surface of the swamp. Then hundreds more. They were surrounded. As night fell completely, fear took control. The soldiers tied themselves to mangrove roots with belts and ropes, terrified of slipping into the water if they fell asleep. No one rested. No one closed their eyes. And the swamp began to move. Sounds echoed through the darkness. Splashes. Low, heavy movements through water and mud. Then the first scream from the rear of the column. Then another. The attacks were fast. Silent. Precise. Shapes surged out of the water, grabbing men from low branches, dragging them down before others could react. Gunfire exploded into the darkness, muzzle flashes revealing brief glimpses of massive armored bodies before everything went black again. Panic spread. Discipline collapsed. Men fired blindly. They shouted warnings that came too late. Some tried to climb higher, slipping on wet bark and moss. By midnight, the swamp was no longer quiet. Far offshore, British sailors aboard patrol boats heard it. At first, they thought it was a counterattack. Then they realized it was something else. Thousands of voices screaming at once. Not battle cries. Not commands. Pure terror. The sound carried across the water, rising and falling like a storm that never moved. A British naturalist accompanying the Navy would later write that it was the most horrifying night he had ever experienced. Not because of violence, but because of helplessness. No army was fighting back. Something else had taken control. And it was only the beginning. As the night deepened, the swamp revealed a terrifying truth. Weapons meant nothing here. Japanese soldiers had trained for jungle warfare. They had faced artillery, tanks, and air raids. But nothing in their training prepared them for predators that did not fear gunfire. Saltwater crocodiles are not mindless animals. They are patient. They learn patterns. They test weakness. As panic spread, the crocodiles adapted. They began targeting men who were exhausted. Men gripping branches too low. Men who slipped. Men whose strength finally failed. Gunshots echoed, but they changed nothing. Rifles designed to stop humans were ineffective against thick armored scales. Bullets struck water, mud, bone, and vanished. Even direct hits failed to stop the attacks. Some soldiers realized the horrifying reality. They were not fighting enemies. They were inside a system. A food chain. As the tide slowly rose, conditions worsened. Water levels crept higher, covering the mud banks the soldiers depended on. The trees became slick with moisture. Arms cramped. Hands lost strength. Every slip meant death. Some men fell silently. Others screamed. The screams never lasted long. The crocodiles learned another tactic. They began striking the trees. Massive bodies slammed into trunks, shaking branches violently. Men lost balance. Belts snapped. Bodies fell. Each splash triggered immediate movement below. From above, survivors watched helplessly, frozen by fear. To climb down meant death. To stay meant waiting. Waiting for exhaustion to decide. The psychological toll broke even the strongest soldiers. Officers who had commanded men through months of brutal combat now stared into the darkness, powerless. They heard their comrades calling for help, begging, crying for home. There was nothing they could do. As the hours passed, survival became random. Not strength. Not rank. Not courage. Only position and luck. Near dawn, the the swamp fell into an eerie silence. The screams faded. The gunfire stopped. Movement slowed. Those still alive barely breathed, afraid that even sound might draw attention. When the sun finally rose on January 27, 1945, the swamp revealed what the night had done. British officers observed from offshore. The water was no longer brown. It had changed color. The surface was still. Unnaturally still. Along the muddy banks lay massive shapes, unmoving. Crocodiles basking in the early sunlight. Bloated. Motionless. Scattered among them were remnants of an army. Helmets. Rifles. Boots. Torn packs. No formations. No bodies in ranks. Just debris. British patrol boats cautiously entered the swamp. They expected resistance. They found none. Instead, they found survivors. Not soldiers anymore. Just men. One clung to a tree branch, barely conscious. Another had buried himself in mud, hiding from movement. Some could not speak. Some could not look at the water. In total, fewer than 24 men were pulled from the mangroves. Out of nearly 1,000. Doctors later noted something unusual. The survivors were not just injured. They were psychologically shattered. They flinched at reflections. They recoiled from water. They screamed when touched. When questioned, they spoke very little about the British. They did not describe combat. They spoke of eyes, sounds, shadows beneath the surface. One survivor reportedly said, "The war was simple. The swamp was not." Historians would later debate the numbers. Some claimed hundreds died. Others believed the toll was even higher. Exact figures may never be known. But one fact remains unchanged. An entire regiment entered the mangroves. Almost none came out. The Battle of WWII Island ended not with a surrender, not with a final charge, but with silence. It became one of the most disturbing reminders in military history. Technology does not guarantee survival. Training does not conquer nature. And control is always an illusion. Today, WWII Island is quiet. The mangroves stand tall again. The swamp looks peaceful from a distance. But beneath the surface, nothing has changed. The crocodiles are still there. History moved on. Empires fell. Maps were redrawn. But the swamp remembers. And it waits.